Good afternoon. Welcome to Changing Minds. I'm your host, Joe Devlin. A few weeks ago, I saw a cartoon where a tidal wave labeled COVID-19 was approaching the UK. Right behind it was an even bigger wave labeled Brexit, and behind that was a humongous wave labeled climate change. Independent of your feelings towards Brexit, I think we can all agree that climate change represents an existential crisis, if not for us, then certainly for our children. We can see the next wave coming, but what are we doing to survive it? This is exactly what keeps today's guest up at night. Dr. Pernille Holtedahl is an economist and founder of Blue Maya, a research and consulting firm that advises both governments and private organizations on climate change projects, particularly within green finance. Welcome to Changing Minds, Pernille.
Thanks, Joe.
So pleased that you could be here today. Before we get started, I'd just like to invite the audience that if they have questions as we go along, please just put them in the Q&A box, and we'll get to as many of them as possible as we get towards the end of the webinar. Okay, so with that said, Pernille, when I think about climate change, I tend to think about the things that I can do personally, like walking or using recyclable bags at the grocery store, that kind of thing. You really seem to approach it from a different angle, right? You think about what governments and organizations can do. Why is that so important?
Well, I think it's actually important to start out by saying that climate change is not an environmental issue. If that sounds strange to you, I would say, okay, it might be an environmental issue, but it's not just that, because it's something that affects so many aspects of our lives and the entire economy. It impacts the stability of the financial sector. We have, financial sector can be invested in sectors or in assets that become stranded, meaning they're no longer productive because of climate change. That in turn might decrease investments or returns on your, let's say, pension pot, etc. Climate change affects how we live, so the housing sector, mudslides, floods, etc., which we've had, many instances and experiences of that in the UK. So climate change really permeates a number of aspects of our lives. There was a report by the Bank of England in May or in June 2020, so just last month. And the opening paragraph read, "The COVID-19 pandemic is causing unprecedented disruption to our daily lives and the global economy. The threat from climate change is just as real and potentially at least as devastating." So this is the Bank of England last month, and I'm just putting it out there because with COVID and the disruption that's causing to our lives, I think is a sort of a good reminder and a comparison to come out with. So it's very powerful stuff, I would argue, and yet we do, as you say, very little about it. So maybe we can just bring up the cartoon again. Can you bring that up as a slide?
Let's see, let me see. Just need to share the screen. Hopefully, there we go. Right, so you found the cartoon then.
Yeah, I found the cartoon, and let's start today by reflecting a little bit on this cartoon and why it is that climate change is recognized as a massive wave, and yet we act as if it's not there. And that's partly to do with cognitive biases, and that's why we are talking here today about this topic. So we can talk about these biases both at the individual level, organizational, political levels, etc. So George Marshall wrote a book a couple of years ago on Don't Even Think About It, where he discusses many of these different biases. For instance, we're subject to the bystander effect. We take cues from people around us. If we see that our neighbors aren't doing anything or changing their lifestyles in any particular way, we think, well, I suppose I don't have to either. Or we, as part of that, we assume that someone else is handling it. It has to do with the whole idea of social conformity. And something that's also not helping when it comes to climate change is that the effects, some of them come and go. So for instance, you have droughts or floods. They're very much there and then they're not there. And so we forget about them. And other effects are so gradual and they're almost become imperceptible. So for instance, the fact that bees probably are disappearing or in the process of disappearing, and temperatures are increasing. But for instance, to you and I, the fact that the global average temperatures have increased by say 2 degrees over the past 100 years, we wouldn't be able to, we don't feel that. So we don't feel climate change to be as threatening as it should. Another reason is that we don't feel climate change to be as important as it should is that we don't relate to science in the way we should. So we know that to sell an idea, it has been shown that it pays off to be less technical and more emotional. Yeah. Climate scientists, however, they speak mostly in terms of facts, and they use more facts. If they're confronted by climate skeptics, they respond by throwing even more facts at them, thinking that that will somehow solve the problem. Thomas Schelling is a Nobel Prize winning economist. He famously wrote about this contrast between the statistical and the identified life in a brilliantly named essay called "The Life You Save May Be Your Own," which was about funding of healthcare and contrasting how we're unwilling or less willing to contribute to the everyday running of a hospital, which may save many lives, but we do respond much spontaneously and generously to a campaign where you see a picture of a young girl, for instance, who needs a life-saving operation. So that also applies in climate change, is something that we find it difficult to relate to and difficult to see. And finally, in the US especially, there is politics and the whole messenger. So it's not so much about necessarily the message as the messenger. And in the US, the idea of climate change has been grouped together with other liberal ideas. So a lot of people, or people who don't identify as liberal, will reject the idea of climate change instantaneously just because they associate it with other values that they reject. So that's sort of at the individual level, I suppose. Then you have at the government level some of the biases and constraints we operate with there. The fact the short-term nature of politics is not particularly helpful. Climate change is a long-term problem which requires long-term solutions, and so it's difficult to make this fit in with a political cycle. Then we're dealing with the whole issue of discounting and loss aversion. For instance, this desire we have to avoid certain losses. For instance, the short-term cost. Making the investments today that need to be made in order to climate-proof our future will entail an upfront cost, and the benefits is something we will harvest over many years to come. So at the political level, there's a discrepancy there. Nicholas Stern published his famous Economics of Climate Change review in 2006 and showed that if back then one invested in order to climate-proof the economy, in order to withstand and improve our ability to meet the challenge of climate change, it would cost something like 1% of GDP growth. And at the same time, they showed that if not doing that and instead postponing it and suffering in the future from all the effects of climate change would take off between 5 and 25% of economic growth. Yet, despite that, so despite the fact that it would be rational to make the investments and avoid those future costs, for the most part, governments decided to sit on the fence. So, coming back to your question, yes, climate change requires global solutions because it's a global problem. We, of course, as individuals can and should do what we can, but ultimately the big changes will come from big changes on a large scale for the whole economy, and some of the things we can do won't lead to those results that we need at the scale where we need them to happen. So it's one of those misnomers that we say that if we all do a little, we'll achieve a lot. And in climate change, that doesn't really work. If we all do a little, we'll really just achieve a little. We need big solutions, and of course at the individual level as well.
That's really fascinating, and it just points to all these cognitive biases that you mentioned, and you came up with a list of some big ones there, all of which are sort of working against us in this case, which is a bit scary, and it's easy to understand how we can ignore that tidal wave in that scenario. Is the main issue energy policy? So for instance, I read during lockdown, Britain hasn't generated any coal power electricity for months. Is that the kind of thing that we need?
Sure. I mean, energy is incredibly important. So greenhouse energy sector is responsible for about 1/3 of greenhouse gas emissions globally. The second third comes from transport, and the last third, 1/3, is from all the other sectors. So, land use, forest, manufacturing, etc. So energy is a key sector. And what's happened in Europe, in UK, North America, and other economies in terms of decarbonizing the energy sector has been very important, impressive. It's been a concerted effort. What's important to remember, though, is sometimes we look at what we do, and that's very important. But again, coming back to this issue of the fact that climate change is a global problem, we also need to look at the rest of the world, and we need to get them on board. So I was wondering, could you maybe bring up the next slide I have? Yes, exactly. So this is a screenshot from Carbon Brief, and it shows basically the extent of coal-fired power plants around the world. So you'll see, and the color is just, that's all you need to really pay attention to. The the gray and white colors means that the coal-fired power plants are closing. So we're taking them offline. Whereas, and you see, the yellow, pink, orange means that they're operating or coming online or in the pipeline. So in this case, orange and red and yellow is bad, and the white and gray means good. We see then that sort of in North America and definitely in Europe, we're phasing out coal. South America seems to have avoided it more or less altogether, which is amazing. You see the big hotspots now for coal-fired power plants is in Asia. So India, China, Malaysia, Indonesia, also South Africa. So I'm saying this because it's important, like, again, to bring in put in place global solutions for this. And this doesn't sort of happen on its own. You need policies that can bring these things and give the appropriate incentives. China is an interesting case where China has been over the past few years the largest wind farm developer in the world, but they've also been the biggest developer of coal-fired power plants. So they managed to do both. They just need a lot of power, etc. So to some extent, we can think of the energy sector being a sector that we sort of won already. We have already managed to decarbonize it, at least in certain areas, certain parts of the globe, and we need to bring the rest of the world with us. But then there are other sectors that we definitely need to work on. So transport being an important one, electric vehicles, etc. And we're working on that. I mean, some countries have come far. The UK is also making some progress on this. Coming back to energy efficiency, a lot of people are talking about this in the next decade becoming hopefully the decade of energy efficiency. So we're in particular talking about insulation, house insulation. That's very challenging, but very important, because it's not just about it's about consuming less, and also whatever energy we're producing has to be of the green sort. A lot of people refer to climate change as a wicked problem, in which case you could definitely say that energy efficiency is a wicked problem, because if we're making it's difficult to retrofit basically the housing stock in countries like the UK, then you have the last sort of third in terms of the importance of greenhouse gas emissions would be the land use sector, together with others. But land use and forests is obviously, and has received a lot of attention in the past few years, forests being very important, not just for CO2 absorption, but also for biodiversity, etc. So about 7% of tropical deforestation is caused by commodity production. And in fact, by the commodity production of 4 big commodities: palm oil, beef, soy, and pulp and paper. And so that's there are lots of efforts going into that area as well, thankfully.
Wow. Okay. And you've done some research on how to use behavioral science and behavioral change methods to help support this kind of greening work. Can you tell us a little bit about it?
Sure. Um, so in the forest sector, and relates in particular related to these four big commodities that I talked about, there aren't that many regulations, but what you have instead are companies that take on what we call voluntary supply chain commitments, or no deforestation commitments. So big companies like Unilever, Nestle, etc., say that for our products we will not use palm oil or timber or whatever it is that has been grown on land that was recently deforested. There are lots of these commitments out there. I think there's about 800 or 900 from different companies and different types of commitments. Of course, the devil is in the detail, because these commitments are not always comparable, and sometimes it's literally just one line at the corporate level sort of policy, which we also have struggled to understand really how it's implemented. So, and obviously there's no point in, or very little point in, having these commitments if they're not implemented. So we were thinking about how can we make these commitments more effective? Are there nudges or behavioral instruments we can use to make them more effective? So maybe you can bring up the next slide. Yep, thank you. So again, what we're looking at here are companies making commitments, and how can we make them both, well, mostly that they make sure that they take on commitments, and that also that they implement them more effectively. One, we're using the EAST framework, so we have nudges that are easy, attractive, social, or timely. And a couple of them, I've just put two of them up on the screen there. One of them is, for instance, many of these companies are members of large organizations or industry bodies worldwide. And one idea would be to make enrollment or a commitment to one of these supply chain commitments automatic when you join one of these organizations. Yeah. So you're sort of using a default type of nudge to do that, rather than having this to be something that companies ponder and wonder about. And maybe it's particularly important for smaller companies who are wondering about whether, you know, how to do this, or can probably think of a number of excuses for not doing it, making it automatic and receiving help in how to do it would be presumably help them in their process. Another one we looked at was an attractive nudge. One of the challenges, and that's related to the cost, taking on one of these voluntary supply chain commitments would require, for instance, being that you have to be able to monitor your supply chain. You have to know what companies you're buying from, down to the farm level, individual farmers. There's a lot of, and if you're going to have it verified according to standard, for instance, there are definitely some monitoring and verification costs. Those costs typically are incurred upfront, whereas the benefits, which could include things like premium products and higher prices for your products, you know, because they receive a premium, they typically occur further down the line. So there are ways of smoothing out these costs. So, for instance, backloading some of these costs so that they occur more at the same time as the benefits. So these are some of the nudges that we're looking at playing around with, and hopefully one day could also try to test, but at the moment it's just at the research stage, really.
Sure. Well, the opting out as opposed to having to opt in is such a powerful tool. We've seen it a lot in things like retirement planning and other areas. So that does seem like a very strong one. And I love the idea that you introduced this kind of transparency, as you said, maybe even down to the farm level. Is that something that you see as playing a big role? Because I wouldn't have thought that it would be, one, easy to do, and two, necessarily something that companies were that keen on, right? I mean, a lot of them don't always share all that level of detail.
No, they find it very hard, and so, well, at least smaller ones, and partly it has to do with culture and size of the company, etc. But transparency is becoming a big deal in climate change now, within this sector, but also other sectors, for instance, finance. I definitely believe here in the tipping point theory, which is that nothing happens until suddenly everything happens, and that you can have lots of small incremental changes which then all of a sudden, when time is ripe and you have enough of a momentum and critical mass, things happen. So I think that's happening right now in the finance sector in terms of transparency. At the beginning of our chat, I quoted a Bank of England report, and that Bank of England report that I was quoting from was their TCFD report. So TCFD stands for the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, which is an international effort to bring more transparency into the finance sector globally. So this report was a Bank of England's effort in explaining to us, their stakeholders, everybody in the UK economy, how, in what way, and also try to quantify it, they are exposed to climate change. That's becoming increasingly common in the finance industry, and it may not sound like a big deal, but transparency is, and as you suggested, can be difficult to do for some, and it leads to other things. So I've definitely experienced that this is not something that's sort of opaque or going on behind closed doors in the corridors of City and of London or in New York. It has important practical effects and large shifts. The work was started by Mark Carney when he was at the Bank of England. But it's, it can have, it's having ripple effects currently in the investor community. You've probably heard about divestments. So when you decide not to invest any longer, or your pension provider is deciding to pull out of coal investments, for instance. So that's one way of having increasingly engaging the finance sector. But we're also increasingly seeing that people are interested in the concept of sustainable investing. And so those of us, so if you're fortunate enough to be offered a pension by your employer, for instance, you can typically choose your funds. And increasingly now you see that people can opt for sustainability, or ESG, so that stands for environmental, social and governance, screened funds or companies. Increasingly, I think that will become the default within the industry, especially with the new millennials who view these things as take them for granted that a more sustainable behavior is the way we should act, and that's linked again to this idea of transparency, asking questions. I work with, in the financial sector, I work with companies and I ask them, do you provide this kind of transparency, so report according to the TCFD? So a minority will say yes, a majority will say that we've been thinking about it, and minority again will say no, we haven't really heard about it. But all the ones that I ask and that are not doing it yet, at least a large share of them will then, I notice that they think about it and then they come back, and then the following year they've started doing it. So asking questions, having good leaders out there who are doing the right thing, and then others will follow.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And before I get to some audience questions, I guess the one thing that I want to ask is, are we doing enough? Are we getting to these tipping points fast enough?
Well, I think we have to be optimistic, because fatalism is not going to get us anywhere. And we have to believe that we're able to make those necessary changes. And when you say fast enough, though, the question will be, well, in comparison to what? We will not go back to being, the world and the world around us is not a constant. So it's more about, will it be good enough, and will we be able to adapt to a whole new way of living and limit the damages, come up with, adapt when we need to adapt. So I think, it's not a sort of a binary choice between making it and not making it. We just need to, basically do as much as we can and make sure that where we're getting to and is a livable world, really. And I'm also quite optimistic, because there are companies out there who are doing great things. I mean, companies like Tesla, who would have thought, right? There's the largest car manufacturer in the world now. The crazy guy who had a crazy idea, and whatever other controversies around it, we are where we are today because there are people out there who are innovating. So, because I believe in also these I think more and more, despite what we said at the beginning about cognitive biases, I think things are changing, and hopefully changing now in time for us to find a livable way of or a livable world, basically create one.
Okay, great. Well, let me turn to some audience questions here. Jill has asked, she says that it seems like there is an ethical issue here, and I guess it's related to your ESG that you were talking about, that not only is it ethical for individuals to do their part, but then there's an ethics for companies and governments to play their role, to be involved in these processes. Do you think that that's kind of a unifying theme to what is motivating people at a personal and as an organizational level to make changes?
There's the ethical aspect for sure, and I think sort of a couple of things on the ethics. You know, individuals like Greta Thunberg, and even COVID. I think COVID, because people have had more time to think and to notice the sky around you and the reduced emissions, etc. So you can think that there is an alternative to the way we have been living. And Greta Thunberg, because she's playing into the emotionals, which was something we talked about earlier about facts versus emotions, and she does that very well. And that centers around that ethics, and more time for reflection then leads to us thinking about whether this is where we want to go or not. Ultimately, climate change or whatever changes you're making in a company needs to make sense for that company. At the time, for the time being, companies still operate in a system where they have to make money and they need to make a profit. How you define that profit and the time scale of the profit is maybe changing a bit. People are starting to think a bit more long term, and there are things there we can do in terms of regulation as well, in terms of how we instruct investors to think. So I think it's both ethics, but ultimately that needs to be aligned with companies being able to make a living, because only then is it sustainable.
Sure.
These companies need to survive, and we all need to survive, but we need to make sure that model is one which doesn't damage the economy or that damage the natural economy, natural world more than it's already doing. And that's why where governments and enabling policies ultimately is what needs to guide us. There's only so much we can do on our own. We need to be provided with incentives and an operating environment where these decisions make sense for us to make individually or as organizations.
Cool. There's another question here from Fred saying, do you have numbers about the relative contribution of behavioral solutions versus other types, like from governments and such, with respect to things like emission reduction potential?
I don't have any numbers. If I were to venture a guess, I don't think it's the contribution of behavioral science to this field. I don't think has been very significant. So far, and also I'm not entirely sure how I would quantify it, but I think there's potential to employ behavioral incentives to a greater extent than we've seen today. I also think that.
Well, that's what I was going to ask. Do you think that's because they don't help, or just that they haven't really been used to their full potential yet? I suppose it's early days, so reflecting back on some of the other speakers at your webinar, where we have certain good ideas and then we go and test them, and then you see that actually some of these, they don't have the effect we intended. I think we have, by the time we get to, we haven't tested that many in the field of climate change in terms of behavioral changes. The ones that have been used have been more at the individual level and been more related to environmental issues, more broadly speaking, about supermarkets where you place products, meat-free diets, etc. That's where we've experimented more with it. On the large global solutions for decarbonizing the economy, I don't think we've tested them very much at all, and I think there's definitely potential. That's good news, and I might actually stop on a high point then, because it's nice to think that there is some potential here, and that further work in this area could lead to some sort of empirical benefits, but also hopefully more people like Greta Thunberg or whoever who can be these emotional advocates who not only take the evidence but then can put it in a package that's going to help push these tipping points forward. That all sounds incredibly hopeful from my perspective. So I would like to thank Dr. Pernille Holtedahl, founder of Blue Maya. It was really great to get an economist perspective and to see how these kind of behavioral science approaches are being used to tackle possibly the biggest issue facing all of us as a species. Thank you so much, Pernille.
Thank you very much, Joe.
It's been delightful. I'd just like to add that we are going to take the month of August off. So we will be back in September with a new series of Changing Minds. And I hope that you guys all manage to enjoy your summer break. And I look forward to seeing you in September. Thank you very much. Have a good one. Bye-bye.